Hello, everybody. This is Rob Goldstein from the ALS Therapy Development Institute. It is just a couple of minutes after 3 o'clock. Sorry, we're starting a couple of minutes late this afternoon, but we will begin the webinar in just a moment. I do want to start by reviewing the recording policy for today's webinar, and then we'll hop in. So today's webinar is being recorded. We record these webinars so that people that cannot join us for them live can gain information that's displayed on them, as well as those of you that are on with us live are able to come back and review the information again whenever you want. So if you have registered, you will receive an email to a link to the recording as soon as it's up online. That usually takes a couple of days. If somebody could do me the kindness of telling me that you can hear me just fine and see my screen with the title June 13th, 2018 on it, we'll be able to confirm that the technology is working as expected. Thank you very much, Carol, for confirming that. So as we move forward with the recording, I do want to let people know that your phone lines are muted. So if you're trying to say hello, I appreciate it. You can say hello in the chat box, as people are doing right now, confirming that you can see and hear me just fine. As we do want to make sure that everybody's anonymity, should you want to have that, is protected. As you ask questions in the chat box, I will just refer to you as your first name when I'm trying to reply to them. So I may say, thank you, Erin, for that comment, or Mary, great to hear from you. Here's an answer to your question. Look for the cue of your first name when I'm addressing your questions. You are encouraged to enter comments and questions throughout the webinar in the chat box, as many of you do right now. And if you do prefer, or if it's easier, because I do know that ALS affects everybody differently, and in fact, it may be easier for you to ask a question over the phone. If that's the case, just hit the raise hand button, and I will say, hey, I see that Jennifer has a question. I'm going to unmute your phone line, Jennifer. I'll then unmute her phone line, and we'll hear her question that way. But so that we get everybody's questions addressed, the preference is that we get those in through the chat box. So we will dive into the webinar content now. Excuse me as I spit out a hard candy that I was chewing on, which is causing me to mumble. So today's webinar is really meant to try to provide a mid-year reflection on where we're at research-wise in this space towards the development of effective treatments and cures. However, a really interesting thing happened recently here in the United States of America, where the United States Congress passed a new law called the Right to Try Act of 2018. It was named after a number of different individuals. I'll get to that in a minute. But we had to kind of modify our content for today's conversation so that we can include some updates on that law and try to mass provide some information to folks with ALS that are interested in it. So we're actually going to start our conversation there today around the Right to Try bill, things that we know and things that we do not know. After that, we'll come back to the original idea for today's conversation, and that was to update on late-stage drug trials such as MP001, Masitinib, NurOwn, ODM-109 is probably something many people haven't heard about. We'll also talk about a expanded access program from Biohaven. I do also want to spend some time today providing an overview from Dr. Perrin, our CEO's talk that he gave last month in May, during May ALS Awareness Month. Steve got on to the webinar and gave a 90-minute presentation, or almost a 90-minute presentation on stuff going on here at TDI. So I'm going to give you a 10-minute summary of that in case you haven't listened to that recording or you didn't join us live, give you an update on some of the things Steve talked about, and of course, have plenty of time for conversation. So those are our items that we're going to try to cover today. Since we had to add the Right to Try bit to this, we may not have as much time for the open discussion, but we'll try to get there as quickly as we can. In fact, it really is your questions and comments that have to drive the conversation. That is the point, to answer your questions, to address your comments, to incorporate your thoughts and ideas in this research process until we find effective treatments and cures. So please do enter those questions, comments, and ideas into the chat box, and if we don't get to them live, I will email follow-up with you afterwards. If you're joining us in the recorded version of this webinar, please feel free to email questions anytime to us at ALS TDI. Just email let's talk, LETSTALK at ALS.net, and we will get back to you. So, before we get to Right to Try, I know there's a few people who have not actually been on a webinar before, so this is actually where my institute was started. It was started in the basement of a person with ALS. He's the guy in the back there with an orange t-shirt. Orange is my favorite color, so I always like looking at this photo. Stephen Haywood was his name. He was diagnosed with ALS in 1998. We were founded in 1999. Stephen was diagnosed before the age of 30. And his family decided that they were going to solve this problem. Nobody had a treatment or a cure for Stephen, so they said, we're going to own this problem. We're going to solve this problem by thinking differently about how medical research is occurring in the United States around ALS. Ultimately, they envisioned what we are today, the world's first and largest nonprofit biotech devoted to a single disease, ALS. But they didn't get there alone. Along the way now, almost 1,500 different family funds have been created at the ALS Therapy Development Institute in supporting the execution of that vision of creating a nonprofit biotech that was solely focused on a single disease and helping to find effective treatments and cures. So as those names scroll across the screen before you there, they helped build this facility, which is now 26,000 square feet of grade A lab space, more than 30 full-time scientists working in the lab, which you see an image up on your screen here. I don't really want to spend too much time talking about ALS TBI today. I want to talk about the new legislation, those trials of interest, and get to people's questions. You can find out lots of information about our organization at ALS.net. We have the sole and profound mission of discovering and developing effective treatments for ALS. In the last many years, we've identified several exciting compounds. I will talk a little bit about AT-1501 and where we're at with that when I get to recapping Steve's presentation. But that's not the only thing that's come out of our research that's really exciting. Our lab at ALS TBI joined two other labs around the world, one in Oregon, one in Melbourne, Australia, that showed through preclinical testing the hope that is in CopperATSM as a treatment. We partnered with a small biotechnology company out of Switzerland called NurOwn to show that going after the SOD1 protein itself with an antibody slowed down disease progression. Working with another collaborator in France, the Institute of Myology, last year we actually showed that using a gene therapy, a viral form of gene therapy, to suppress the activity of the SOD1 gene actually slowed disease progression. So our lab is really interested in discovering effective treatments for ALS preclinically and translating those into the clinic. AT-1501 will get there this year, and we're working to bring the rest of those compounds, we hope, to the clinic in the future. One way to say that otherwise is that if the funding existed at TDI, we'd probably be running trials on all of those compounds, but we just don't have the funding to do that. But we know that more than one treatment is going to be needed to cure ALS in everybody that's diagnosed, so we continue to look for other potential treatments. So we screen 20 to 25 different drugs in the lab every single year. That's more than any other lab in the world. But we don't just screen drugs. We try to develop tools that everybody can use to move things forward. And these are new preclinical models, specifically mouse models of ALS. We've actually set the worldwide standards for the SOD1 mouse model, and we're looking to develop and do the same for TDP43 and C9orf72. And then many of you on the phone today probably are enrolled in our precision medicine program, which was the world's first to be innovated to identify not just phenotypes of ALS and screen new drugs for those individual subtypes of the disease, but to also really hammer on new technology as potential new clinical endpoints. And I'll give you some data on that when we get to Steve's recap. So again, you can learn lots about ALS TDI by going online at ALS.net and digging into our research program there. But those are the brief overview for those of you that this is your first time joining one of our webinars. At the end of the day, all the science I can talk about is exciting to me, but we are always reminded at ALS TDI that ALS is not some abstract disease. It's people that come into our lab, that visit us, that talk to our scientists about their life experiences. This isn't a disease to us. It's our friends and our family that are battling it. And we never lose sight that it's really people that we talk about when we talk about solving this problem. So Right to Try. This image is one that many people saw across your television screens or the front of your newspapers around the country a couple of weeks ago. President Trump signed this bill into law, which makes the Right to Try bill the law of the land. In this image is right up front there is a guy in the gray suit. That's Matt Bellina. Lieutenant Commander Matt Bellina served our country in the U.S. Navy proudly for many years before being diagnosed with ALS. The bill carries his name as well as the name of the young man there standing next to the desk with President Trump, as well as Trickett Wendler and Frank Mangiello, who is not in this image. Trickett lost her battle to ALS a few years ago. Off to the right of this image, I want to also recognize is a guy named Mike Sambora, who's standing there with his wife, Nicole, who were important advocates in this effort. So the advocacy aside, now that the bill is the law of the land, what is it? What do you need to know? Well, Right to Try was, in essence, a new pathway, a new way for people that want to access drugs outside of a trial to try to do so. It doesn't replace all the other pathways. So there's been many other ways for people with ALS or other life-threatening disorders that couldn't get into trials to access drugs. So it didn't replace those other pathways, it added a new one. In short, this bill replaces all of the state laws around Right to Try that existed. There may be some stuff to be worked out there in the courts yet on whether or not some aspects of those state laws continue or not, but we'll leave that to the courts to figure out. I just want to give you a general overview of the bill and how it affects you. The most simple summary I can give you of Right to Try compared to other pathways to access experimental treatments outside of trial is that it reduces the burden on the FDA to approve access to those treatments. It doesn't, many people say that it leaves the FDA out entirely. It really doesn't. The FDA has a much smaller role to play under Right to Try access, but it doesn't leave the FDA out entirely. The FDA still must monitor some things. It still has to have an eye open to what's going on under Right to Try, but it doesn't leave the FDA out entirely. The next steps, now that President Trump has signed the bill, is really on the FDA itself. It all kind of starts there. The Food and Drug Administration must interpret the law and execute more or less new rules on how it's going to happen. How does a physician certify a patient? To whom do they provide that certification? How does a company provide the FDA the information the law requires them to provide them, such as adverse events at the end of the year? Who at the FDA gets that information? So before somebody starts accessing drugs under Right to Try, the FDA has to release, and whatever that means, some new rules around this bill. Now, members of Congress, specifically Congressman Johnson, who is the lead author of this particular bill that got passed, has been really clear that the FDA was not under this bill to be empowered to create a whole new regulatory structure. He and the Secretary of HHS, actually in an op-ed, basically said the same thing, felt that this bill could be enacted or implemented within a relatively short amount of time. I am pegging that myself at weeks, maybe months. I don't think that there's anybody out there who thinks that it's going to take years for Right to Try to be implemented. But it's not happened yet, and we're only a week away from it, or a little bit more than a week away from it being signed into law. So it's probably somewhere in the weeks to months range before that first person with some life-threatening disorder really has an idea on how to act under this law. We're staying at ALS TDI really close to it, to the advocates that were involved in bringing it forward and other experts that are thinking about it, as well as talking to companies that may have products that could fall under this law. And we'll get to that in a moment. So what does the law not do? And I wanted to talk about it this way because I thought that it was really important that people with ALS know what the law doesn't do. First and foremost, the law does not compel or require any company with any drug in clinical trial to offer it under right to try. The government doesn't say under this law, you must provide this to people with ALS outside of your trial. Nothing in the law compels or requires a company to do that. So I hate to say it, but it almost doesn't matter necessarily how much an individual patient wants to access an experimental treatment. If the company doesn't want to give them access to it, the law doesn't say that they have to. And that's not unlike the other avenues, such as compassionate use law that exist today. So that's not new, but I want to make sure that people don't have the misconception here that right to try all of a sudden tells companies what they must do. It doesn't. The law also doesn't require that companies treat people equally. So, this is something probably controversial for me to say. Any company that offers a drug under right to try can have two totally different agreements with two different patients. They may be able to charge those patients different amounts of money for access even. They may have two totally different agreements between patients with different diseases. Nothing under the law provides for equal protection or equitable treatment for individuals who the company provides access to their treatments for. And that's an important point, I think, so that two people with ALS access a drug under a company or from a company and they've learned that that company's charging them different amounts. That's totally legal for that company to do under this law. There's no protection in place against that, whereas under single patient compassionate use laws that exist today already at the FDA before right to try did, the FDA, by being involved in those, had an avenue to push back on the company and require them to explain why they were charging that patient a different amount of money under compassionate use. Today, there's no avenue for somebody to push back on that. And thirdly, there's no part of the law that requires the company to publicly make their right to try policy known. And again, I want to point that out so that if you're a person with ALS and you hear of somebody else accessing a drug under right to try from a company, and that company says to you, oh no, it's their policy not to offer it, there's nothing under the law that requires that they make their policy equitable or known to everybody. And this makes it really hard for me and others that want to be able to provide people with ALS information about which companies are providing access under right to try. There's no way for me to know for sure that if I talk to some pharma company and they say, yeah, Rob, we're never going to offer access to it, they may go turn around and offer access to it and never tell me that. And that's totally fine under this law. They don't have to be public about their policy across the board for right to try. I think these things that the law does not do does potentially lead to some challenges for people with ALS, in figuring out if this law isn't something that they can work with or not. So it's something to know about. That's the point of this slide. The next bit I wanted to talk about was, so what can people or whom can take advantage of this law? Very clear that people with ALS probably meet the terms to qualify for access under right to try. Basically the law says that a person must be certified by a physician to have a life-threatening disorder. ALS certainly would meet that criteria. That physician must say that you have exhausted all approved treatment options. Most people with ALS probably wouldn't have a hard time getting a physician to say that, as well as unable to get into a trial on the drug that you want. So if there's a drug that you want and you can't get in the trial because of exclusion criteria, that's probably all the physician has to say. So it's very likely that people diagnosed with ALS would qualify for access under the law. Now, what companies are doing right to try? This is the question I'm getting constantly and our team is getting constantly. We don't know. The short answer is no company that I'm aware of has said that they will offer access to their experimental treatment under the right to try law. Nobody's come out and said that yet. There are some companies that have been very proactive in having that conversation in our field, and one of them is Brainstorm Cell Therapeutics, the makers of NurOwn. They held a webinar last week and engaged with people with ALS and got their feedback on if they did at that company offer an Right to Try, what would that look like? How would people feel about that? So they've engaged in that discussion. I have another drug up here called ODM 109, which in my reading of the law on which drugs would be eligible, I'm pretty sure that ODM 109 would meet the standard of an eligible drug under the law. I think there are probably others as well. So I'm not, I don't have an exhausted list up here on the screen, just giving you a couple of examples that are both in phase 3 clinical trial. I think it's safe for me to use them as examples, but I'm sure that there are others. In essence, for a drug to be eligible under this law, first, the FDA has, it can't be an already approved treatment. So if the drug is already approved to treat something else, then that wouldn't be, so if you're trying to access a drug that's already approved to treat cancer, for example, that wouldn't be accessible under Right to Try. You'd have to go under some other access program at the FDA likely to access it. But the drug does have to have passed phase 1. It doesn't mean that the phase 1 had been successful. It just means that the phase 1 must have happened. It doesn't necessarily in the law say that the phase 1 has to have been done in your disease indication. Just says that the phase 1 must have occurred. So there's probably some interpretation that have to be done with that. But in short, for a drug to be eligible, it must at least have already been in some trial in some way, have completed that trial in some way. It also must continue to be in trial. And this is something I think that people, when the bill first came out, maybe didn't pick up on, was that one of the clever things they did in this law was they said for a drug to be eligible, the company must show that they are continuing to look to make that drug broadly available and to continually determine whether or not that's a good thing to do, meaning that it works. If a company stops researching a drug in clinical trial, let's say they get through phase 1 and then they never look at it again in any clinical trial in any way, that drug would not be eligible under this law. A company must continue to show that they're interested in actively pursuing having that drug ultimately be approved by the FDA. If they aren't doing that, then it wouldn't be eligible. So this is, in general, what a drug to be eligible would have to look like under Right to Try. But at the end of the day, right now, June 13th, no company has said that they're going to offer a drug to people under the Right to Try law for ALS or any disease indication, to my knowledge. So bottom line, you should consider all of your options. Compassionate use program at the FDA is available right now. It's a program that you can get approval for access in some cases within 24 hours. So it's a program already available to people. So if you're considering Right to Try, you should at least consider that as well. It does require the FDA to sign off on use, but it's an option to you right now. There are lots of drugs in clinical trial, including those that you may think that you want access under Right to Try. So make sure that you're at least ruling out the trials first. You know, if you're unsure if you've exhausted treatment options, you know, go down that path, really solid Darabone. You know, I think when people talk to me about asking me what should they do to prepare for Right to Try, you know, I'm telling them that they should have a conversation with their doctor and make sure that their doctor agrees with them that they've exhausted treatment options, because ultimately that doctor, some doctor is going to have to say that they have. So making their doctor aware of that and having that conversation with them now is probably a useful one. And we're unsure what the companies are going to do. So I think that people with ALS can reach out to companies with drugs in development that they think they may want to access it under Right to Try, and proactively, I think patients can let those companies know that they want them to offer it under Right to Try. I think that that's helpful for companies to know if there's interest out there. Don't assume that the companies know. And you can find a lot of times easy contact information for companies on their websites to do that. So I want to stop there, take a breath, and see if there are questions about Right to Try before we hop into the clinical trial part of it. So I'll just briefly wait a minute in case people are typing stuff out. And feel free to follow up with us at TDI separately if you have further questions on this topic. It's an evolving one, but it's one that we want to make sure that we're out front of for people with ALS. So feel free to ask questions later on. So the next section of today's discussion was to try to review some late-stage clinical trials. And I wanted to start kind of at the end of that conversation, and that is to review some clinical trials that were recently completed that read out negative. I think that this is a good place to start because I got 2 questions about it today from folks around a drug that's read out negative. So I want to try to, through this webinar, get some even more knowledge and awareness out there about where some of the latest stage trials are. We're going to start with a drug called tirasemtiv, which read out at the end of last year negative results. This is from a company called Cytokinetics. They've been running this drug in trial for a long time. They've done some really wonderful trials on the drug tirasemtiv, and ultimately, at the end of last year, they announced that tirasemtiv missed its endpoints in its phase 3 trial. And this was obviously, anytime a drug misses its endpoints in phase 3, it's a big disappointment. This was a bit of a letdown for sure. There were so many people with ALS that were involved. We were always hoping for positive results. The company didn't back away from ALS, though, and I'll talk about a follow-on trial that they're doing later on. But this was a letdown. In essence, the drug was thought to fail in their clinical trial, they thought, because of too many side effects. And that was a real challenge for sure. But tirasemtiv, their CEO was very clear that they had no plans to further pursue the development of tirasemtiv at Cytokinetics, that they were working on other drugs instead, including one that they're looking at in ALS. The next one I want to briefly talk about is NP001. NP001 is a small molecule that's delivered, it's infused through an IV. It's meant to target the immune system in people with ALS. There was a confirmatory phase 2 trial that read out this last April. And this trial that was done really interestingly in that a previous trial that they did through post-hoc analysis, meaning they looked at all the data afterwards and tried to see if there was some sign of efficacy in any of the data. And through that post-hoc analysis, the researchers felt that some of the people in the trial did have a slowing of disease progression, and they all seem to also have higher amounts of what's called a biomarker, something called C-reactive protein. So the researchers looking at NP001 did a second trial where they only enrolled people that had an abundance of C-reactive protein, and they gave those people NP001. That trial read out this past April at the American Academy of Neurology meeting, and the researchers there reported no impact on disease progression. That the trial, was successfully done, but it did not reach any endpoint that showed a statistical impact on disease, which again was a very sad moment for all of us that had a lot of hope that maybe this drug would have worked. Certainly not least of which the hundreds of people that participated in those clinical trials. This company had a big shakeup in its management and structure pretty much the next day after these results came out. I don't think that there's a path forward for NP001 and ALS, but we'll have to wait and see. I think it's pretty unlikely. So I would say that as with tirasemtiv not being followed up on by its company, I don't think Neuraltis is going to follow up on NP001 and ALS. They may follow up on the use of NP001 in other diseases, but I'm pretty sure that it's not going forward in ALS. The next drug that read out negative, and I know I'm being negative Nancy right now, but I want to make sure there's awareness of these results because it still seems to be that maybe there isn't. There's a drug called Masitinib, which was in a phase 3 clinical trial in Europe over the last couple of years. This drug also targeted a aspect of inflammation or the immune system in people. It meant to stop, in essence, specific cells from getting into different parts of the nervous system and causing other cells to get agitated, or this thing called neuroinflammation to occur. Long story short, Masitinib was in a clinical trial over the last couple of years. The principal investigator of that trial, Dr. Mora, stated that there did seem to be a dose response in the clinical trial, but he wanted another phase 3 trial to occur, and the company was starting to plan that. At the same time, the company did submit all that data to the EMA, the European Medical Agency, which is like the FDA in the EU. The EMA came back and said no. They said, we are not going to approve your request for authorization to market your drug as a treatment for ALS. The EMA said no for several reasons, not the least of which that they felt that the company had biased investigators at 2 of its enrollment sites, as well as that the company may have done some interesting statistical analysis in some of the data that they presented to the EMA. These aren't my personal reflections on the data. This is what the EMA said when they said no to the company. AB Science, the company, did say that they were not going to fight the EMA on that decision. Rather, AB Science said that they were going to file a whole new application with additional data from the trial with the EMA. There was no timeline given for that application, so I don't know when they're going to do that. And truly, I don't know if they actually will. The company's gone back and forth on saying they're going to do some things with the EMA. Originally, they said that they would fight the EMA on their ruling. Then they said, we're not going to do that. We're going to file a new app. So I don't know exactly what they're going to do. We're going to have to just wait and see. But right now, Masitinib doesn't have a clear path forward to patients at this time until a new application goes in, I guess. So in the chat box, Judy asks, do you intend to make I think you mean 1501 available under Right to Try after you complete phase 1? Judy, I don't know the answer to that question. I think until anything is done with that drug in trial, it's probably imprudent to talk about anything past that. The goal is to get the drug through phase 1, and then I'm pretty sure that any company with a drug would say, hey, we got to at least see some data before we talk about something past phase 1. So that's how I would respond to you on that. The next part of the discussion this afternoon I wanted to hit upon was to talk about noteworthy clinical trials that are enrolling. So now that we've gone through kind of the stuff that's already read out, let's talk about what's going on right now in clinical trial. And the first thing I wanted to talk about, if I can get my mouse over there, is, it's a pretty cool thing that a company is doing. This company is called Biohaven Pharmaceuticals. Biohaven has a drug called BHV0223 that they're going to ask the FDA to approve as a new treatment for ALS, and that's pretty cool. Last year we had a drug approved by the FDA. We could have another drug approved by the FDA this year to treat ALS. In essence, BHV0223 is riluzole, which on the surface may not sound all that exciting or interesting, but if you're one of those individuals who was told by your doctor, hey, riluzole isn't going to be an option for you because you have a liver issue that can't be overcome with the drug, or if you're unable to take riluzole because you can't swallow pills, then maybe this is an option for you, because BHV0223, what Biohaven has done here is they've basically put riluzole into a tablet that when you put in your mouth, under your tongue, the tablet dissolves instantly, which if you can't swallow a pill means that you could actually start taking riluzole now. And that may open up an opportunity to try riluzole as a treatment to, maybe hundreds of people that otherwise couldn't have accessed it for toxicity issues or swallowing issues. And what Biohaven is doing here is they're actually offering, sorry I hopped ahead, they're actually offering at least 250 people with ALS access to this dissolving tablet right now for free before the FDA rules whether or not it's going to approve it. Biohaven has set up what we call an expanded access program, and they're offering access to that experimental drug right now through that program. To qualify for it, you must be able to show that you aren't able to swallow pills. Basically, you need a doctor to certify that you can't do that, and or have had previously been denied for toxicity issues access to Riluzole. So that expanded access program is open right now, and I'd encourage people to consider it. It's a new way to access Riluzole. So there are 2 or 3 late-stage clinical trials that I do want to talk about. All of them do have placebo arms as opposed to the EAP program that does not. The first phase 3 trial that I want to talk about, probably pretty obvious. It's the only phase 3 trial that's enrolling right now. It's on a drug called NurOwn. This is a stem cell-based treatment or proposed treatment for ALS. It aims to try to address a loss of support in the central nervous system by replacing some of the lost cells, replacing some of the activity that those lost cells would have done through this thing called neurotrophins, and then perhaps by addressing that issue also provide some protection against neuroinflammation, but that's a little bit more downstream. In essence, NurOwn is a person's own cells where the researchers on behalf of the company will go in to the person's body. They will extract that person's own cells. They will take those cells. They will make those stem cells become a particular type of support cell and then put those support cells back into the person's body. The study does, the study right now is about 30% full. It does entail many treatments to in a site. So there are 6 different clinical research sites around the country, 3 of them in California, 3 of them outside of California. I'm sorry, I don't have Cedars-Sinai listed on my slide here. That's the other site in California. But you have to go to the site, I think, about a dozen times in this trial. During 3 of those visits, you will get something put back into your body. The trial is 50% placebo-controlled. So that's something to consider for sure. You cannot be on edaravone, which is an FDA-approved treatment for ALS, and be in this trial. You have to be in the trial for about a year, which means you can't do anything else in trial for about a year. Like I said, it's 50% placebo-controlled. Based on the phase 2 data, the company does believe that those with a faster form of ALS, meaning losing basically more than 1 point a month, are more likely to show impact from their treatment in this trial. So the company is optimizing, as they put it, this phase 3 trial for fast progressors. So if you aren't a fast progressor, most people would say that's a really good thing, myself included. But if you're trying to get in this trial, if you're a normal or slow progressor, it's unlikely that you're going to be accepted, or your opportunity to be accepted, I guess, rather said, is lessened. Bottom line, it's the only phase 3 trial enrolling right now in the world in ALS, and people are starting to receive their infusions. So, the trial is 30% enrolled. I believe that several people in the trial are already on their second, perhaps even their third round of treatment. Another trial I wanted to mention that is currently enrolling, it's in phase 2. It's on a drug called AMX0035. This is a combination therapy of 2 different treatments together, put in a powder together. One of those is called TUDCA, the other one's called phenylbutyrate. Both of those treatments were tried separately in other trials. Neither of the trials that they were tried in separately worked in the sense of showing disease progression, but those are early stage trials, so they were never powered or designed to really measure for disease progression. what this group of researchers from a company called ALS has done is they put these two treatments together, or proposed treatments together, and said, I wonder if I put them together if there'll be a big effect. So this combination trial is currently enrolling. There's very little preclinical data published on AMX0035. That's not uncommon, to give them at least some credit. Many pharmaceutical companies don't publish anything on their drugs until they're in late-stage trial. But there is little preclinical data, so I can't really comment on this combination approach. Like I said, there were previous trials done on the two separately. This is a phase 2 study. It's primarily meant to look for safety and tolerability of the combination therapy. There were tolerability concerns with the two drugs used separately. So I think it's wise of them to begin by establishing tolerability in this trial before they ultimately look at efficacy. They are taking a peek at it in this phase 2 study. It's a very large trial, enrolling probably somewhere within a day drive of everybody with ALS in the country, not just on the coasts, but in the center part of the United States as well. It is placebo-controlled, 1/3. You can be on edaravone and go into this study, so that's a plus for those of you that want to and can access edaravone. The trial does last about 24 weeks, so let's say half a year. One of the cool things that they're doing in this study, as opposed to the company that's running the NurOwn trial, hasn't committed to offering access to folks beyond the trial. This company in the phase 2, they have said, yeah, if you come into our trial, you give us 24 weeks, you accept the opportunity for placebo, so long as nothing bad happens in the trial, they've committed to offer access to open label access to their treatment. I know they're already offering, or people have already completed the AMX trial and are already enrolled in that open label arm of the trial. So that's a good sign that it doesn't seem like there initially were safety issues to prevent that. Bottom line, if you're a person who is on edaravone and want to continue to take edaravone, this is probably the trial option for you, as well as you're a person who is really turned off by placebo and you really want to go into a trial where you can be guaranteed access. There are very few of those out there. This one, at least, in exchange for 24 weeks of a third opportunity to get placebo, they're going to give you access to this drug for a year through that open label, maybe even beyond that. So this is a pretty good option for those of you that want to stay on edaravone and want guaranteed access to the real thing at some point. The other trial I wanted to mention is a follow-up trial from Cytokinetics, a company that did the trial on tirasemtiv that failed. This company didn't back away from ALS, which is really unique, and it deserves a lot of credit. Most companies, when they have a failed drug trial in ALS, have said, see ya. This company stuck with us in this field, and we're really grateful for them for doing so. They do have a second-generation version of tirasemtiv, I'll call it, called reldesemtiv. This is basically a drug that goes after the same thing in biology and kind of sensitizing muscles to calcium uptake so that they're more sensitive to contraction when the body asks them to do that. They are enrolling right now in about 30 different sites, or more than 30 different sites across the United States as well as in the European Union. Good coverage across the US, lots of different sites. It is placebo-controlled. It's a very short trial, 12 weeks. You can stay on riluzole and edaravone throughout the study, which is good for those that can tolerate and want to access those drugs. It has a very welcoming enrollment criteria compared to us. Bottom line, if you want to stay on edaravone and be in a study that's short, that doesn't have a long-term commitment because it has placebo as well, this is probably the study for you. They are not committing from that company access to that drug after the trial, though, which is a downside. But if you want to participate in clinical research and do a short study, that's probably the one you want to go to. There are two other trials I want to talk about that we got some updates over this last few months on as we give this mid-year update. One of them is a drug called ODM 109. I know this says 168. I'm sorry, that's an old code name for it. ODM 109 is a small molecule drug. It is going after a similar target to what the Cytokinetics guys are going after. This is from a pharmaceutical company called Orion Pharmaceuticals out of Europe. They ran a phase 2 trial in Europe over the last few years. They read out some interesting trending results from that last year at the international meeting here in Boston. They're launching or planning to launch a phase 3 clinical trial here in the United States. They've actually already published the trial design on clinicaltrials.gov, and we have it on our site at als.net. So this trial is absolutely going to happen, it looks like. Their target is very similar to what Cytokinetics is going after again, trying to sensitize the muscles to calcium uptake so that as you lose connectivity and therefore calcium signaling, that the muscles may be able to maintain ability longer, which means that you may have a slower loss of disease or slower loss of function as you go through your ALS. This is a phase 3 trial with slow vital capacity as its primary endpoint, which is interesting, which is the same outcome measure that Cytokinetics used in their phase 3 trial of their original drug called Tirasemtiv. So it'll be interesting to see if these guys hit that endpoint or not. So in this trial could produce the basis of an application before the FDA if it meets its endpoints. 450 people are expected to be enrolled. It's a very short trial, so to speak. It's only 12 weeks. So it's a pretty high bar that they've hit or that they've set in this trial. It's not enrolling yet, but the drug is approved for other disorders in the EU and not in the US. So this is an interesting trial, definitely something to know about that's come up in the last few months. So I wanted to make sure we talked about it here on this mid-year review webinar. I want to stop there real quick before I get into recapping Steve's talk from last month and see if there are questions on any of the drug trials that we reviewed or if folks want to talk about anything that we just covered. Feel free to enter those questions into the chat box as you have them. So I'm just waiting a minute or two to see if folks have questions specifically on trials. I know folks have questions on other things, but right now for this webinar, I want to make sure we focus on the trials. Terry asked, was ODM 109 used for other neurological disorders? Sort of, Terry, not solely used in neurological disorders, but it has been looked at in others, yeah. It's not approved. ODM 109, it has a brand name as well, but I'm just going to call it ODM 109 right now. It's never been approved for use in the United States for any disease indication. Interestingly, Orion Pharmaceuticals has licensed the development of that drug outside of neurological disorders to another company in the US. So I don't know exactly what their path forward here is. But in Europe, it is approved for use, not in ALS, but in other disorders. Thanks for asking that question. It gets a little bit complex when you look at the licensing arrangements around that drug worldwide. Judy asked, are you aware of any drugs that are FDA approved that may be worth trying for off-label use? You have a couple of questions, so we'll start there. You know, Judy, that's a really tough question to react to. Am I aware of any drugs that are FDA approved that may be worth trying for off-label use? You know, we try not to give specific advice to people certainly regarding off-label use. So I'm afraid I probably can't react to that. Do I think that there are some interesting drugs that may be worth trying? I mean, there are many drugs that are already in clinical trial in ALS that are approved for other diseases. So that would be off-label, as you say. You know, they range from things like retigabine or tocilizumab, which are in trial right now, that some people think are worthwhile to put in trials. So you could say that they may be worthwhile for off-label use. You know, Masitinib, which, you know, if it had gone forward, I guess it was in trial, so some people would have said that that would have been worth trying for off-label. But I typically don't just say, hey, I think this drug is worth use or not. Pemazide is being looked at in Canada in trial right now. You know, so therefore some people could say maybe that's worthwhile. There was a paper out last week actually that said that it's probably a terrible idea to put that drug in trial. So we'll see whether or not that trial goes forward or not. Judy's next question is, also, are you aware of any trials of devices that may improve quality of life, such as something that can be put on hands to help them work, notwithstanding atrophy? Judy, there are a number of devices that have been developed that are kind of exoskeleton-like. Some of them react to a person's existing and remaining strength. So that's, I was out in Minneapolis a week ago or so, and I heard from a company that had an interesting product that did that. If you want to email me directly, I can point you in the right direction on some products that are already out there that are right around the use opportunity. So email me on that one, and I'm happy to follow up. Or just reply to the registration email, Judy. You don't have to try to find my name. Just reply to the registration email. So in the last 10 minutes here, I want to review what Steve Perrin covered in his webinar last month again, because I think it's really exciting and really important for people to know where we're at with some of our projects here at ALS TDI, because we're all about transparency. So the first thing that Steve talked about last month was precision medicine, and I stole a couple of slides from him that I want to show you guys because I thought they were really interesting. And he started his talk about precision medicine on asking the basic question, why do this? Why spend donor dollars on a precision medicine program in ALS? And Steve said that, you know, it may help us address some of the issues that we see in clinical development, such as patient heterogeneity. It may help us figure out how to stratify patients in and around the sporadic issues of disease. It may help us identify new clinical outcome measures. And it may overall, therefore, in the clinical trial setting, allow us to address one of the real limitations, which is cost effectiveness. Clinical trials are really, really expensive because the patients are heterogeneous and it's hard to measure outcomes. It may also, as Steve said in his talk about this, try to develop some new modeling opportunities with this disease. It may help us to integrate those cell-based models better with in vivo model or with mouse models. It may help us improve target identification and lead identification. These are really kind of pharma words. They're a little bit more on the geek side of the use of precision medicine. They probably have more long-term impact than more of the short-term stuff around improving clinical trials in ALS. And certainly, Steve felt that it was worth investing donor dollars in precision medicine because they would allow for even more community engagement, collecting of data, sharing of data, allow people with ALS to monitor their disease at home, which in turn allows them to determine whether or not something they may be doing, such as an off-label treatment, as Judy was asking about, is being effective in treating their own disease. So Steve put up a slide in the webinar last month around enrollment statistics. I think he tried to highlight that in the middle of 2017, we had 309 participants. And then at the end of Q1 in 2018, which is this year, we are at 485 participants. So a good growth amount there. Lots of data collected. Now we're getting close to the end of Q2 in 2018, so it's probably even more than this. I think we actually have a little bit more than 510 people enrolled right now. Lots and lots of ALS-FRS scores, lots of voice recordings, etc. Demographics, I also thought this was interesting that Steve presented on. Very heavy male demographic in the precision medicine program. Age seems to be right about the average age of onset. Most people with ALS in the program seem to be joining within the first year of their symptom onset, not diagnosis, but symptom onset at diagnosis being about a year in. And then the rest of these statistics seem to be in line with what other people in other programs have seen. Certainly a very heavy Caucasian or white population in our program, which may present a challenge as well. Overview of, Steve spent about 20 minutes on PNP in his talk. I'm going to give you the very, very high level bit. If you want to hear about it, go back to where you registered for this webinar, and you can find this whole webinar online. In essence, Steve said that enrollment is ongoing, and I've said that twice on this slide, that we need to hit 750 people to hit full enrollment. So there are about 330 spots, I think, still open. The accelerometer analysis done to date does show that those accelerometer data do track with disease progression in a very similar way to ALS-FRS, but since you do those accelerometers at home, the burden on the patient is less. Similar with the voice data, which Google analyzed and confirmed through an algorithm that you may be able to use just a voice recording and some accelerometer data at home to tell whether or not somebody's progressed in their disease versus the last time that you checked in on them. And these types of outcomes may allow, should they be validated, may allow researchers to accelerate all clinical trials of ALS. So just imagine if you never had to go to a clinic again to get checked up on to see if you've progressed in your disease in a trial. What if you were able to monitor somebody entirely at home? You'd be reducing the burden on the patient. You'd be reducing the cost of the trial dramatically because you wouldn't have to take a doctor away from doing something just to go do a measurement for that trial. So these are really interesting outcomes. And also Steve talked about the genetics work that's been done at ALS TBI to date, our partnership with the Broad Institute to dig into those genetics data. He did mention in brief on the webinar, you can go back and listen to the full one, the cell line work that's been done at TBI, the phenotyping work done on more than 40 different induced pluripotent stem cell lines right now. But I think the point that Steve was trying to make mostly was that this is a really exciting point in the precision medicine program because we had some early outcomes that may have broad global impact on how trials are done. We're really excited about our partnerships with Google to analyze that data and the Broad Institute to analyze that data. We'll be publishing all that work here before the end of the year as well. And if you haven't already signed up, please consider signing up. I'm going to skip past a few of the data sides on precision medicine here. Again, you can see these and hear Steve talk about them more in depth on his webinar, which again is available right where you signed up for this one. And you can enroll in the program in just a few minutes online at als.net, answering a few questions, and a team member will get back to you and figure out just how you can become part of this very, very large program, which includes participants in 20 plus different countries around the world. One of the other things that Steve talked about that I thought was super interesting was a whole set of science efforts or drug screening efforts that the scientists at TBI had undertaken to try to go after a specific aspect of biology, which is happening in the motor neuron cell, in the cell of the motor neuron itself, something that has to do with protein misfolding or what we call protein or the unfolded protein response. And this is something that results, better shown in this next image, from when you have these misfolded proteins happen. They occur there on the left side here in this kind of teal-looking semicircle. When you have these misfolding proteins occur, they kind of group together. They form aggregates or kind of these stress granule things, and they cause bad things to happen in the cell. So in essence, the issue here is how do you how do you get rid of these misfolded proteins? How do you unfold them? How do you trash them? How do you get rid of them? So on this slide, you're seeing a very complex biological pathway at all the different things that are involved in trying to prevent those misfolded proteins from killing the cell. And in red, you see 4 different areas in which the science team here at TDI, based on the resources it had, has tried to go after this pathway and try to address this pathway and stop it from getting all the way over onto the right side where you have this red word, apoptosis. Apoptosis is cell suicide in essence. So how can we intervene early in this process to stop the cell from killing itself? So in these red text are different drugs that the team brought in-house to screen very, very robustly in preclinical models to see if something made sense to move into trial. And Steve outlined in his talk some work around 3 of these approaches: guanabens, GSK 414, and salubrinol. In short, guanabens in our research made animals worse. It exacerbated the disease, and that research actually has already been published. The GSK 414 approach also exacerbated disease, which was a letdown because we were hoping that would work. And a third approach using this class of drugs around a thing called salubrinol, where we actually took salubrinol. It was really hopeful in early studies. So then we said, okay, could we make a better or more potent form of salubrinol that would actually maybe reach statistical significance so that we would move forward into a trial? We took salubrinol and we tweaked it in a bunch of different ways. So we ended up with dozens of different versions of salubrinol, screened the best of those in-house, and still nothing really seemed to slow down disease progression. So we've tickled the unfolded protein response in lots of different ways here in the lab, and have yet to find a good way to modify its activity to try to slow down disease. And Steve went through a whole series of conversations around that. I thought that was a really interesting part of his talk, and I'd encourage you to go back and look at it. I think it really highlighted how the ALS TDI team, many of us know us right now about our work on 18-1501, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but we're really not stopping. We're looking at all aspects of ALS biology that we can based on the resources that we have, and really diving deep and try to go after that biology in lots of different ways. So on this last slide is right from his talk. It's from Analyxis Therapeutics, which is the drug company that's moving AT-1501 in the trial. They have created a tremendous amount of this drug for the trial. They have prepared the drug for trial. They do anticipate having the phase 1 trial of AT-1501 begin to enroll here before the end of the year. As soon as there's more information about the timing of that trial, enrollment criteria, et cetera, they will be making that announcement on Analyxis first, and then I'm sure that we'll be nearly at the same moment putting out an announcement here at ALS TDI. I'll stop there as we've come to our full hour and see if there are additional questions that folks have about Right to Try, which we've covered here today, late-stage clinical trials, other clinical trials of interest that we've talked about, Steve's presentation, my brief overview of it that I just gave in 10 minutes that took in 90 minutes last month to walk through, or if there are things that folks just have questions about anyways. Feel free to enter any of the questions you have in the chat box now. Otherwise, feel free to email them off at any point. If you've joined us in our recorded version of this webinar, there's the email address to send your questions to, or dial that phone number, ask for Rob, and I'll be happy to talk to you on the phone. So if there are questions folks have, feel free to type them in the chat box, and happy to address them. And I know a few of you have asked other questions in the chat box, and if I haven't replied to them, I will reply to them privately. Some of them are a little bit off topic, so we just want to keep today's conversation on topic. And so enter questions you may have about Right to Try, clinical trials, or Steve's presentation last month. All right, if there aren't necessarily other questions, happy to end this webinar more or less on time. Those of you that are on with us live, please know that you will receive an email with a link to the recording when it's available so that you can come back and listen to it. I'm sure you want to hear my voice again. And those of you that have joined us in the recorded archive version of this webinar, we hope that you found this both interesting and helpful. Please do email us questions at info, that's info, @als.net, or call us anytime at 617-441-7200 and ask for Rob, and I'm happy to take your questions then. Otherwise, I would wish everybody a good rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is where you are, and know that all of us here at ALS TDI are 100% committed to advancing our mission, which is the discovery and development of effective treatments and cures. We have a wonderful upcoming fundraising event called the Tri-State Trek, which is 270 miles on a bike from Boston, Massachusetts to Greenwich, Connecticut. Those of you that are on the phone that will be at that event, I look forward to seeing you there. If you aren't going to be at that event and you're thinking about getting involved, there's still time to get involved. You don't have to come out and ride. You can join us as a member of the cheer squad and come out and cheer folks on. If you're a person with ALS in the area, I'm sure that all the riders would love to see you. Feel free to follow up with us by email for more information about that. Have a good rest of your day, everybody. Bye-bye.